8:42 a.m., Fayetteville, North Carolina. The air was crisp, the sun cutting through the morning haze like a quiet blade. Malcolm Davis gripped the steering wheel of his black sedan just a moment longer than necessary. His watch ticked mercilessly. He hated being late, especially here, especially today. He wasn't here on federal business, not this time. He was here for something personal, mundane even, a clerical error on the tax records for a modest, aging house on Lawson Street. The house was the one his grandmother had lived in for over 4 decades, the same house that taught him discipline, prayer, and how to button his shirt straight. The city had hiked the property tax without notice or reason. He had the papers to prove it was wrong, the receipts, the assessments. The law. He wasn't worried. In his world, the world of prosecutors, courtrooms, and legal warfare, truth backed by evidence still mattered. Or so he thought. By the time Malcolm stepped onto the granite steps of the Fayetteville Municipal Courthouse, it was 8:46 a.m. His shoes tapped a quiet rhythm as he walked with purpose through the doors, his dark navy suit absorbing the light like armor. The courthouse was already stirring. The faded walls buzzed with quiet anxiety, couples with traffic disputes, landlords clutching eviction notices, a grandmother flipping through a folder labeled Utilities. A clerk barked out names like a reluctant auctioneer. Malcolm took a breath and glanced down the hallway. Room 204, Judge Harold McConnell. That's where his name would be called. The courtroom was already half full. A young white woman in sweatpants slid in behind him, her coffee still steaming. An older white man in a wrinkled gray blazer entered moments later, whispering something about parking. Nobody flinched. Nobody was stopped. The judge didn't even lift his head. Malcolm eased into the second row, opened his folder, and reviewed the cleanly tabbed evidence. He had 10 minutes to spare. At 9:15 a.m., the bailiff called his name. Mr. Malcolm Davis. He stood. Shoulders straight, voice steady, but the moment he reached the podium, everything shifted. Judge Harold McConnell looked up. The man was in his late 60s, tall, clean-shaven, with thinning silver hair combed to authoritarian precision. His eyes locked on Malcolm like a man inspecting an unexpected package. Then it came. "You're late, Mr. Davis." The voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp, deliberately public. Malcolm raised his hand slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize. I was delayed responding to an urgent federal matter earlier this morning. Excuses," the judge cut him off. "Don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, perhaps you should reevaluate your priorities." A low murmur swept through the room. Malcolm could feel it, the heat behind his collar, the sudden weight of every eye on his skin. He glanced for a split second at the woman in sweatpants scrolling on her phone. The man in the gray blazer is now whispering to his attorney. No reprimand. No fine. Only him. Malcolm took a deep breath, anchoring himself. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. I'd like to present the documentation for the tax adjustment. The property—" "We'll get to that," the judge interrupted again. "But first, there's the matter of contempt." Malcolm blinked. "Contempt? Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings," Judge McConnell announced, his gavel in hand. "You are hereby fined $750. The blow landed harder than any physical strike. Gasps didn't erupt, but the silence that followed was louder. Malcolm's jaw tightened just slightly, but his face betrayed no emotion. He had stood across from murderers, cartel bosses, and human traffickers. He knew how to control a room. He knew when power was being performed and weaponized. He tried to speak. Calm, respectful, careful. "Your Honor, may I explain?" "You may not," McConnell barked, the gavel slamming down like a door. "Consider this a lesson in respecting this courtroom." Malcolm stepped back. But he wasn't defeated. He was analyzing. This wasn't about tardiness. Not really. This was about something much deeper, about who deserved to walk in late and still be seen as civil, about who didn't. Back at his seat, Malcolm's folder lay open, but it wasn't the tax documents he focused on. It was a blank yellow notepad. He began to write. Not his defense, not his rebuttal. At that moment, Malcolm Davis, Assistant United States Attorney, had spent 10 years in the Department of Justice and knew what he had just witnessed. And he wasn't going to let it slide. The courtroom moved on, but something in the atmosphere had changed. A young law student in the back had stopped typing. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably in place. A man 2 rows ahead, black, maybe mid-60s, turned just slightly and gave Malcolm a knowing glance. Not pity. Not a surprise. Just confirmation. The kind of look passed between people who've seen the game played this way too many times. And Judge McConnell? He didn't flinch. He'd done this before. But this time, he picked the wrong man. The house wasn't just an address, it was memory, lineage, and survival, wrapped in weathered bricks and the scent of Sunday dinners. And Malcolm Davis had no intention of letting it be swallowed by a clerical error. The house on Lawson Street had been his grandmother, Ruth Davis, a seamstress, a Sunday school teacher, a woman with hands worn from work and a voice that didn't tremble even when the banks turned her down because she was black and alone. She built the house without loans, shortcuts, and certainly without apologies. That was where Malcolm had been raised. That was where he learned the value of being precise, being prepared, and never being late. So when the Fayetteville tax office issued a sudden 30% increase on that property, without notice, without reason, Malcolm didn't get angry. He got organized. At 7:05 a.m. that morning, as he ironed the cuffs of his shirt and brewed his first cup of black coffee, his phone buzzed. A subject line in all caps, "Urgent, motion to suppress filed." It was about the Jefferson case, a high-stakes federal trial involving human trafficking across state lines. The defense had pulled a dirty move, filing a procedural challenge just hours before court opened. Typical. And dangerous. Malcolm responded immediately. He joined the early call with his litigation team, reviewed the motion line by line, flagged inconsistencies, and drafted guidance for the rebuttal. All within 40 minutes. Efficiency wasn't just part of his job, it was who he was. Still, by the time he slid behind the wheel and headed for Fayetteville, he knew he was cutting it close. He drove carefully, not hastily. Speeding tickets and courtroom appearances didn't mix well, even for federal prosecutors. At 8:42 a.m. he parked, pressed the ignition button, paused, and exhaled. "Let's keep this simple," he murmured. All he needed was to correct a tax error. That's it. Present the documents. Clarify the discrepancy. Done. But in America, simple has never meant the same thing for everyone. Malcolm walked into the courthouse with the quiet confidence of a man who's seen too much to be easily rattled. Dark navy suit, crisp collar, briefcase in hand. Room 204, Judge Harold McConnell. He followed the signs without rushing, passed through the last hallway, and entered the courtroom. The place was already stirring. People filtered in, clutching folders and frustrations. A young white woman in yoga pants slid into the second row with earbuds in. An older white man in a wrinkled coat eased into the back with a sheepish grin. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. The judge barely looked up. Malcolm sat near the front, opened his folder, and reviewed the evidence. Original assessment records, photos of the home, prior correspondence. Everything was in order. He checked the time. He was still early by courthouse standards. When his name was called at 9:15 a.m., he stood, shoulders squared. Steps even. But the moment his shoes touched the worn floor near the judge's bench, the temperature in the room dropped. "You're late, mister." "Davis," Judge McConnell snapped. The voice wasn't just cold. It was accusatory, performative. A rebuke designed not to correct, but to humiliate. Malcolm raised his hand slightly in acknowledgement. "Your Honor, I apologize. I was attending to a federal..." "Excuses," the judge cut him off, the words slicing the air like a blade. "This court values order. If you can't respect that, you may want to reconsider your priorities." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick. Malcolm could feel the eyes on his back. Not sympathy. Not confusion, recognition. Because everyone in that room saw what he saw. He wasn't the first to arrive late. But he was the only one being punished. Still, he kept his tone steady. "Your Honor, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my documentation." McConnell waved a hand like swatting away a fly. "We'll get to that. First, there's the matter of contempt." "Contempt." "You are hereby fined $750, the judge declared, the gavel cracking down like a pistol shot. Malcolm didn't flinch. His face remained unreadable. But inside, something shifted. This wasn't about a tax mistake. This wasn't about tardiness. This was about control, a performance of power, selective enforcement in the name of decorum. He glanced at the woman in yoga pants, still scrolling on her phone. The old man with the wrinkled jacket is now dozing in the back row. Neither had been reprimanded, neither had been fined. He wasn't imagining it. Back in his seat, Malcolm didn't reopen his folder. He opened his notepad. Page 1. Time of entry, 8:46 a.m. Page 2. White male, 60s, entered at approx 8:50 a.m., no warning. He began documenting everything. Who came in, how late they were. How were they treated? Who spoke? Who didn't? You see, Malcolm Davis wasn't just a man with a case. He was a man trained to see patterns, the kinds of patterns that don't show up in transcripts but define outcomes. He had prosecuted people who wore masks of bureaucracy while trafficking humans. He'd seen how institutions hide their worst behaviors behind the soft veil of procedure. And this moment. This was how it started. McConnell had made a mistake. He thought Malcolm Davis was just another name on the docket. Just another defendant to scold. He didn't know who he was dealing with. He didn't know that Malcolm Davis had made a career out of holding people like him accountable. Not with rage, not with vengeance, but with records, evidence, and unshakable truth. That morning, McConnell handed down a $750 fine. He thought it would end there. He had no idea. He'd just given Malcolm Davis the opening move. The room had fallen silent, but not in reverence. It was the hush of discomfort, the kind of silence that follows a slap, not physical, but public, deliberate, and unmistakably targeted. Malcolm Davis stood at the podium, posture firm, voice calm, expression unreadable. A man who had weathered far worse storms than this. But even a seasoned federal prosecutor could feel it when authority shifts from order to performance. Across from him, elevated behind polished wood and the weight of judicial power, sat Judge Harold McConnell. His silver hair caught the light like polished steel. His robe flowed neatly around him, giving the illusion of impartiality. But his eyes, sharp, narrowed, fixed on Malcolm like a threat he had already sized up, told a different story. This wasn't about the rules. This was about putting someone in their place. "You are late," McConnell repeated, as though the moment required reiteration. "Do you believe this courtroom revolves around your schedule, Mr. Davis?" There was no question in the judge's tone, only accusation, already tried and sentenced. Malcolm responded, voice even. "Your Honor, the delay was due to an urgent development in an active federal case. But McConnell's gavel hit the bench before he could finish. "Save it," the judge snapped. "This court is not concerned with your federal prestige. Here, we follow the rules, and you broke them." The words landed hard. Not because they were loud, but because they were so confidently dismissive, not just of Malcolm's schedule or his job, but of his person, his effort, his value. Then came the number, $750. "That is the fine for your contempt. No hearing, no discussion, just a sentence." Malcolm didn't blink, but he felt it, the performance. The optics. The theater of power was less about decorum and more about domination. The fine wasn't about money. It was about the message. He looked around, not to find an ally, he wasn't that naive, but to confirm what he already knew. The white woman in yoga pants who had entered after him was still sipping her coffee. No fine. No name was called. The man in the wrinkled blazer, still flipping through papers, unbothered. Untouched. Malcolm had arrived before both of them, but only he had been singled out. Only he had been made an example. He took a quiet breath and asked, as any attorney would, "Your Honor, may I proceed with presenting the documentation related to the property tax discrepancy?" A simple request, courteous. Measured. Judge McConnell didn't even pause. "You may sit down, Mr. Davis. This court will address your presentation if and when it sees fit." And just like that, Malcolm was dismissed. Not legally. Psychologically, he turned and walked back to his seat, not with shame but with purpose. His hands didn't shake. His steps didn't falter. But his mind was on fire. He wasn't angry, not yet. What he felt was precision. Because what had just happened wasn't merely unjust. It was patterned. It was calculated. And Malcolm Davis was not a man who let patterns slide. He opened his folder, not to organize his documents, but to take notes. He began logging everything. Time of entry, identity cues, order of reprimands. The racial identity of each person was reprimanded or ignored. Malcolm had built entire criminal cases from less. Wiretap fragments. Inconsistent ledger entries, surveillance from a gas station parking lot, and now he was watching this courtroom the same way. What Judge McConnell didn't understand was that he had just walked into Malcolm's arena. Courtrooms were Malcolm's terrain. He had studied body language under cross-examination. He had read hundreds of judges. He knew when power was being applied equally and when it was being used as a weapon. The injustice was no longer abstract. It wasn't a hunch. It wasn't just a feeling in the pit of his stomach. It was data. It was visible. The rules weren't the problem. It was who the rules were for and who they were weaponized against. The next case was called. A young white man in a navy hoodie stepped forward. He had arrived late. Malcolm knew it. He had logged it. The judge's tone? Cordial. Almost friendly. No reprimand. No fine. Malcolm kept writing. In the row ahead, a woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She glanced back at Malcolm, then quickly away. The discomfort in the room was growing. Not everyone understood what was happening, but they felt it. This wasn't fair. They wouldn't say it out loud, but they knew. Malcolm's eyes returned to McConnell, who presided with the kind of detachment that comes only from unchecked power. For years, maybe decades, McConnell had operated like this, demanding respect while showing none to those he quietly deemed unworthy. But now, for the first time, someone wasn't looking away. Someone wasn't staying silent. Malcolm sat still. He listened, he observed, he built. Because this wasn't about a fine anymore, and it wasn't about a judge's attitude, it was about a structure. And the cracks had just been exposed. Malcolm Davis didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam a fist. He didn't ask the judge for a second chance. He did something far more dangerous. He watched. He listened, and he remembered. Every inflection, every exception is made for someone else. Every time, Judge McConnell's gaze softened for a white defendant and turned sharp for a black one. Malcolm logged it all, quietly, efficiently. Not to challenge the system that morning, but to prepare for the moment it would no longer be able to deny itself. As the docket rolled on, Malcolm sat at the edge of stillness, scribbling in a slim legal pad with practiced strokes. He noted case numbers, entry times, and fines issued or not issued. He drew no attention to himself. His calm was misread as compliance. Good. Let them think this was over. When the judge adjourned for lunch, the room emptied in the usual shuffle of heels and hushed frustration. Malcolm didn't leave immediately. He sat for a moment, looking at the bench, now vacant. The same bench where justice was handed out like a private favor, not a right. He could still hear the gavel echoing in his mind. But this time, it wasn't a threat. It was a beginning. Outside, the crisp Carolina air offered no real relief. The sun felt too bright for what had just taken place, but Malcolm wasn't finished. He didn't drive home. He didn't call it a loss. He walked to his car, retrieved a separate folder, one he never used unless necessary, and opened it. Inside, his Department of Justice identification. Federal badge. Credentials are stamped with the United States seal. He'd never flaunted them. He didn't need to, until now. At 12:47 p.m., Malcolm re-entered courtroom 204. The scene had changed. Most of the morning crowd was gone. Only a few clerks and latecomers lingered, flipping through papers, shuffling case files. Judge McConnell sat at the bench, flipping through documents. Tired. Detached. Until Malcolm stepped to the podium. The clerk looked up. Her typing slowed. The remaining few in the gallery turned their heads. Mr. Davis, the judge said, irritated. The session has concluded. If you have further business, schedule it with the clerk. With respect, Your Honor, Malcolm replied, pulling his badge from his coat pocket. I believe a formal introduction is in order. He held it up, not boastfully but with unmistakable clarity. I'm Malcolm Davis, Assistant United States Attorney for the Eastern District of North Carolina. 10 years with the Department of Justice, specializing in human trafficking, organized corruption, and civil rights violations. The room stopped breathing. McConnell froze, hand mid-turn on a page. Color drained from his face, not fear, but realization. Malcolm's voice remained steady. I was late this morning because of an urgent motion filed in an active federal case. But what concerns me more is what I witnessed here after I arrived. He paused. The silence was thick, tense. Absolute. I'll be documenting everything I saw. And just like that, the power in the room shifted, without shouting, without defiance, just presence. You could hear the weight in the silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was held. Like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. At the front of courtroom 204, Malcolm Davis stood tall. His badge is still visible. His voice was calm, deliberate, cutting through the pretense like a scalpel. Judge Harold McConnell, a man accustomed to control, now sat unnaturally still. His fingers twitched faintly on the desk, betraying what his face tried to hide. For the first time that morning, McConnell had no script and no place to hide. "I witnessed multiple individuals enter this courtroom after I did," Malcolm began, his tone factual, not emotional, not accusatory. "Some are visibly late. Some seated mid-hearing. None of them addressed. No fine. None publicly chastised." He paused. "Let it settle. In contrast, I was fined $750 within minutes of entering this courtroom. No prior warning, no context considered, no consistency." His eyes scanned the room, not seeking approval, but accountability. A woman arrived with coffee in hand. A man came in, flipping through paperwork. Neither was reprimanded. "I was." There was no edge to his voice. That's what made it sharper, because this wasn't a rant. This was a deposition. Judge McConnell shifted, his robe rustling like a curtain being drawn back. "Mr. Davis, if you believe you were treated unfairly, you are welcome to file a formal complaint through the proper channels," he replied, voice tight, jaw clenched. A predictable move, retreating to procedure. But Malcolm didn't flinch. He wasn't here to debate policy. He was here to expose the pattern. "I intend to," he said simply, "but not as a personal grievance." He stepped forward, just half a pace, enough to make the distance feel real. "As a federal prosecutor, I am obligated to report any indication of systemic bias in judicial proceedings, especially when those disparities appear to follow racial lines." A ripple moved through the gallery. People shifting in their seats, glancing at each other, blinking like they'd just woken up. They all knew. They had seen it too, but no one had ever said it. Not here, not like this. McConnell opened his mouth, but Malcolm didn't wait. "I've already begun documenting the disparities," he continued, "and I'll be including statements from those who observed today's session, if they are willing to speak. This courtroom, this bench, this authority, it only works when it treats all people equally. Without exception, without prejudice, without performance." The words didn't accuse. They exposed. And that's what made them lethal. The clerk's hands hovered over her keyboard. She didn't dare type. The bailiff looked at the floor. One of the young law students in the back, who had been scribbling notes, froze mid-sentence, eyes wide, realizing this moment wasn't theory. It was history. Judge McConnell's voice, when it returned, was strained. "This court takes accusations of bias seriously, Mr. Davis, but I will not allow my integrity to be questioned in front of spectators." Malcolm nodded once. "I'm not questioning your integrity, Your Honor. I'm questioning the consistency of your courtroom, and I believe the record will speak for itself." Then he said it, quietly, clearly, unshakably, "I saw it, and I will act." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be, because at that moment, something unspoken was shattered. The illusion that silence meant agreement. Those titles shielded actions, that people wouldn't notice when justice slipped from impartial to selective. Malcolm placed his notebook gently on the podium. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, with that same composed professionalism. And then he turned, slow, deliberate, unafraid, and walked back to his seat. Not in defeat. In power. The courtroom didn't move. Not yet. Not until the reality fully landed. This wasn't just a hearing anymore, it was a reckoning in motion. It didn't happen on the courthouse steps. It didn't start with a press conference or a carefully worded statement. It started with a single post, a student, a notebook, a moment. I watched a federal prosecutor get fined $750 for being a few minutes late. Then I watched two white people arrive later with coffee, with excuses, and receive nothing. What made the judge furious wasn't the clock. It was the man in the suit and the color of his skin. Those words didn't trend immediately. They sat there for a few hours, like embers, and then they caught fire. By sundown, it had 6,000 shares. By midnight, the national conversation had begun. Cable news picked it up as a curiosity. Civil rights lawyers picked it up as evidence. Communities that had long whispered about how things really worked suddenly had something to point to. But most of all, people started talking. Old cases were reopened, not legally, but emotionally. People who had carried quiet indignities for years now had a reason to revisit them. And they did. One by one, they stepped forward. Some are in the comment sections, some through legal networks, others anonymously, but all with the same truth. This wasn't new. This was just the first time someone wouldn't look away. A retired public defender from Fayetteville wrote in, "We all knew Judge McConnell had patterns, but patterns don't hold up in court unless someone maps them out." Malcolm Davis just gave everyone the courage to draw the map. Local attorney Lisa Tran published a blog post titled, "Respectability Won't Save You. What happened to Malcolm Davis happens to all of us." Within hours, it was shared by 3 legal advocacy organizations, then by professors, then by judges. But the most devastating blow didn't come from social media. It came from the inside. Angela Mendoza, a former court clerk who had worked under McConnell for over a decade, walked into the Office of Judicial Conduct with a plain brown notebook. No press, no headlines, just facts. Inside were handwritten logs, pages and pages of them. Each entry is meticulously dated. Each case is noted in terms of race, infraction, and outcome. Red ink underlined the worst of it. 8/14/2017, black defendant, late 5 mining, fine $300. 9/12/2018, white defendant, late 9 mean, no penalty. 3/3/2019, white defendant laughed off warning. 10 years of quiet record keeping. 10 years of knowing something wasn't right and waiting for a reason to speak. Now she had one. Reporters called her brave. She just called it overdue. "For years, I thought I was the only one who noticed," Angela said, her voice steady in a televised interview. "But I wasn't. I just didn't know anyone would listen." Then came Otis Langley. It is 6'4", built like an oak tree, and is just as quiet. He'd manned the courthouse metal detector for nearly 20 years. He never said much. Never stepped outside the lines. Until now. He sat across from the interviewer, hands folded in his lap, voice slow and deliberate. "I've seen it for too long. Same judge, same patterns. People like me walk in and get told we're disrespecting the court just by existing. I've seen kids humiliated, grandmothers fined over nothing. And the others? They just got to go home." He looked directly into the camera. "This ain't about feelings. It's about what's fair, and it's time somebody told the truth." The media didn't let go, because the story wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror. Every clip, every headline. Every new testimony added another crack to the wall of silence around Judge McConnell's courtroom. Malcolm Davis didn't say much during that time. He didn't need to. His presence had already done what decades of whispers could not. It made the invisible undeniable. because the moment one person said, "I saw it, and I will act," 1,000 others finally felt safe to say, "We saw it too." By week 3, it was no longer a story. It was a reckoning, and it had a name: Judge Harold McConnell. The Judicial Oversight Committee hadn't planned on intervening. Not at first. Like many institutions, it had a long history of patience, where it should have had urgency. But this time, the evidence didn't knock politely. It kicked the door off its hinges. The Mendoza Notebook, the Langley testimony, the flood of past defendants and public defenders is now willing to speak. It was too much, too detailed, too consistent, too indefensible. Then came the data, cold, clean, statistical, and damning. An independent review of 5 years' worth of McConnell's municipal court records revealed one inescapable truth. Black defendants were fined 3 times more than white defendants for the same infractions. Late arrivals, white, 78% received no penalty. Black, 65% fined on first offense. Disorderly conduct citations, white, 62% dismissed. Black, only 18%. Requests for payment plans. Approved 9 out of 10 times for white defendants. Approved just 3 out of 10 for black defendants. It was no longer about how it felt. It was about what could be proven. And now they could prove it all. The headlines shifted. No longer speculation, no longer just opinion. Systemic bias confirmed. Inside Judge McConnell's courtroom. Justice by skin color. 5 years of patterns exposed. Calls grow for public hearing in Fayetteville. What had once been protected by decades of silence was now naked before the world, each ruling a thread in a collapsing robe of authority. The committee moved fast. Too fast, some whispered, as if they feared what would happen if they didn't. McConnell was summoned behind closed doors. 3 meetings. No cameras, no transcript, but the rumors were enough. One committee member leaked the tone of the exchange. He didn't deny the numbers. He just said he never saw them that way. That was the problem. He never had to. There were calls for public hearings. There were protests outside the courthouse, now daily. Signs reading, "Justice means equal," "McConnell must go," and simply, "We remember." Former colleagues turned silent. Court clerks stopped defending him. Even longtime allies in the judicial circuit distanced themselves. What had once been McConnell's empire, a courtroom that ran on quiet power and unchecked judgment, was crumbling from within. And then it happened. On a rainy Tuesday morning, the court's official email sent out a single-line notice. Judge Harold McConnell has submitted his resignation, effective immediately. No statement, no press conference, no apology. Just silence. Fitting. Because silence had been both his weapon and his shield for decades. And now, it has become the only thing he has left. Malcolm Davis didn't celebrate. He didn't post. He didn't speak to the cameras waiting outside the courthouse steps that day. He just looked up at the building. Same stone. Same columns. But something in the air had shifted. Not a revolution. Not a full transformation, but a crack, a visible crack. And in the courtroom where so many once walked with their heads bowed, people were starting to look up again. Because power, when exposed to the light, is never quite as invincible as it pretends to be. The cameras eventually left. The protests faded, the hashtags slowed down, and when the storm passed, what remained was not applause. Not victory, just quiet and work. Real work. Malcolm Davis never craved fame. When headlines called him a hero, he declined interviews. When a major network offered him a six-figure book deal, he said, "This isn't a story I own. It's one I responded to." He knew better than to mistake attention for justice. And he knew the hardest part wasn't toppling the broken system. It was replacing it with something better. So he went back to the classroom. Twice a week, Malcolm taught a seminar at a nearby law school. Equal justice, theory, and practice. It wasn't flashy. The lecture hall was small. The projector flickered more than it should, but the room was always full. And always silent when he spoke. He didn't teach cases from a textbook, he taught them from lived experience. He told them about the day he stood in that courtroom, about the silence that followed, about the gavel that punished him, but also exposed something far greater. And more importantly, he taught them what came after. Meanwhile, across town, the Fayetteville courthouse looked different, not dramatically, but noticeably. The faded beige walls had been repainted a warm cream. A welcome desk stood near the entrance, staffed with volunteers who spoke English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Somali. Signs were posted in multiple languages. You have the right to be heard. Need help understanding your case? Visit the legal aid desk. People stopped walking in, afraid. They started walking in informed. There was now a deferred payment plan policy, standardized and transparent. No more discretion that punished the poor and excused the privileged. Courtroom clerks had undergone bias training. So had the bailiffs. So had the judges. Because systemic injustice isn't just a person. It's a pattern, and patterns only break with intention. And yes, McConnell was gone. The chair he once ruled from like a throne now belonged to someone else. Judge Elise Martin, 38. Former public defender, daughter of a Vietnamese immigrant and a retired Navy mechanic. She didn't speak with thunder. She didn't need to. Fair, honest, sharp. She asked for context before issuing fines. She paused before reaching for the gavel. And she listened, truly listened, to the people in front of her. The media still followed the story, but the tone had changed. It was no longer just about what had been broken. It was about what was being built. One quiet afternoon, Malcolm stood at the back of the very courtroom where everything began. He wasn't there for a case. He'd been invited to observe a new program launch, a community liaison program, where residents could ask questions about court procedures without fear or judgment. He didn't speak. Didn't make an entrance. Just stood in the back, hands in his pockets, watching a young mother fill out paperwork with help from a volunteer. No panic. No confusion. No shame. Just process. Just dignity. This was never about headlines. It was about moments like this. Moments that don't make the news, but it makes all the difference. The room was quiet, but not from fear. It was the kind of silence that follows reverence, not toward one man, but toward the idea that one voice, in the right moment, could awaken a sleeping system. The walls of the newly opened Malcolm Davis Center for Judicial Ethics were white stone and walnut trim. Modern, humble, honest, like the man it was named after. 100 chairs faced a modest stage where local officials, legal scholars, and community members had gathered. And at the podium stood Malcolm himself. He didn't wear a robe. He didn't carry a gavel. Just a charcoal suit and a voice that had learned to measure truth more carefully than any verdict ever could. He looked across the room, not at the title engraved in brass behind him, but at the people watching. Young students, retired clerks, newly appointed judges, faces that mirrored the courtroom, faces that had once felt invisible inside it. "I want to begin by reminding us all," he said, voice clear and grounded. "Justice is not something that arrives on its own. It does not come down from heaven or rise up from the ground. It must be started. Often quietly, often alone, and sometimes with something as small as a $750 fine." A low, knowing murmur rippled through the room. Behind Malcolm on the wall of the stage was a framed piece of paper, faded ink, harsh language. The original citation, $750, late to court. He hadn't kept it out of anger. He kept it to remember the moment he refused to stay silent. "Justice," he continued, "is not just about laws on paper. It's how we treat each other inside that courtroom. It's whether we listen before we judge, whether we see people or just case numbers, whether we use power to protect or to punish." When I was fined, it wasn't just about me being late. It was about a system that had grown too comfortable deciding who deserved grace and who didn't. He paused, looked down for a beat, then back up, his gaze steady but soft. But that day changed something, not just for me, for everyone who had ever walked into a courtroom expecting fairness and left feeling forgotten. The crowd was still, but the emotion was thick in the air, not sadness, recognition. "This center is not a tribute to me," Malcolm added. "It's a reminder that silence is not neutrality. Watching injustice and doing nothing is complicity, and that even one small act of resistance can become a mirror that forces the whole system to see itself." After the speech, Malcolm walked through the halls. The center had rooms for training judges, workshops for law students, advisory desks for defendants who didn't know their rights. On one wall, in etched bronze, was a quote from his testimony before the Judicial Oversight Committee. "I am not asking for special treatment. I am asking for equal footing." Back at his office, high above downtown Fayetteville, the framed $750 citation hung beside a group photo. A dozen young lawyers, graduates of the first ethics training held at the center, smiling, energized, determined. Underneath the photo was a small plaque. "Hope doesn't walk in. It's carried in by someone who refuses to walk out." Malcolm sat at his desk, typing slowly. Not a speech. Not a press statement. A letter to a law student who had written him months earlier. She had ended her message with a question. "What should I do if I see something wrong?" He finished typing, signed his name, and leaned back. "Don't wait for justice. Become the reason it shows up."